talk about a taboo subject. There's been a number of taboo subjects that go in and out of taboo over the ages. And it seems like all the ones that used to be taboo are no longer taboo, leaving us kind of just with one major taboo subject. And that's the subject of death. Of all the things we're not really allowed to talk about. We can talk about it in terms of fiction, or we can talk about it in ideas of movies or plays, but when it comes to actual death, it is probably the one subject that nobody still wants to talk about. And it's a scary subject for a lot of people. I mean, the Hebrew writer alludes to this here in Hebrews chapter 2, there in verse 15. He speaks of this, that he delivers all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. There is something that all of us share in universally. As there is certainty in life, there is certainty in taxes and in death. And with all the extra government stuff going on, taxes are definitely going to be a part of the future. But death is also going to be part of the future. Rich, poor, American, non-American, young and old, no matter what nationality, no matter what race, death comes to all of us. It is the great equalizer. It's a thing that, after all of Solomon's wisdom and all the things that he dealt with, Solomon has struggles with that idea in Ecclesiastes. That's what the entire book is about. He kind of wrestles with the question of what is the point of being powerful or wealthy or being wise or having all the things at your power if death still equalizes everybody. A lot of people live in fear of death. There's a lot of things that we do to kind of eliminate and to alleviate some of that fear. But the Hebrew writer describes it as slavery. We live an entire life of slavery, knowing that at some point in time, we're going to die. We sit there beside the king with the doom of Damocles hanging over our heads always, knowing that it's going to happen. And we just tend to manage that and just usually just hold it in check for most of us. I think the last year has really shown us just how much we fear that. How much has changed over the last year due to fear of death? A lot. A lot of our lives have changed. International travel has stopped, which has hindered some people from seeing their families. Businesses have closed down. We changed how we move around, how we interact with people. School systems. I mean, the whole list goes over. All of it boils down to what do we do due to a fear of death. And as a side note, we typically are okay with dangers that we are used to and all the uncertainties that we're familiar with. All of us, as far as I know, got here today via a car. We all know that cars are kind of inherently dangerous. You're going to hop in the car, you're going to drive down the road at a rate of speed that our bodies were not designed to deal with. All of us mitigate that to some degree, putting on a seatbelt, driving a car with brakes and airbags and all the extra stuff. But we know that there is still a chance that when you hop in the car, that's going to be the last thing that you do. All of us, I'm guessing, will plan to eat later today. But how many thousands of people die every day due to choking to death? That is a real possibility. We all use electricity, we all use, and the list kind of goes on and on about all the things we're used to. Whenever we're challenged with a uncertainty or a new fear or a new mode of fear that we're unused to, we tend to have a bit more struggle with that. And what happens whenever you're used to the crime rate in your area and you move to another area that has a different crime rate? It's the same thing, it's just a different place, and we tend to struggle with that. We have diseases here, but if you move somewhere else and has different diseases, you tend to struggle dealing with that fear. We tend to cope, but we don't really tend to face things head on. So let's talk about death for a little bit this afternoon. And I would want to start by saying that it's a certainty. And what I mean by that, it's going to happen to all without fail. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, Hebrew writer makes the point, it's appointed for man to die once, and then comes the judgment. It's appointed for you to die. It's going to happen. There's only two people, as far as we know, in all of history who have ever crossed over without the process of physical death. Death in the sense of separation and leaving this body has happened to everyone universally. Even Enoch and even Elijah, they all went through that process of leaving here to go somewhere else with their body no longer existing in that same state and form that it happened. There is nobody who is alive today that has been alive 130 years ago. Nobody. Because death is universally for everybody. And there's a point in time where it's going to happen to me, it's going to happen to you. Guaranteed, promise. That's one thing you can say with absolute certainty. Death is going to happen. And as Solomon deals with in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, we really have very little power over that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 8, Solomon phrases it this way in verse 8. He says, "No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death." You don't have power. Whenever it is time, it is time. As much as you don't want it to happen, your desire to make it not happen is not going to make it not happen. As much as you want to stay here and hold on to your body and to be there for your family and be there for your friends and experience all the things you want to experience, no matter how much you want it, it's just not going to happen. There's going to be a point in time where you lose that battle. To whatever happens to be, you will lose that battle. Guaranteed. And our worry is not going to change that fact. Jesus makes the point in Matthew chapter 6, verse 27, that you, through your worry, cannot add a single hour to the span of your life. Ironically, worry tends to actually decrease the span of your life. So his point is, you can't, by your worry, by your anxiety, by your fears, make life longer. You can't say, well, I'm afraid of death, and so therefore, by my fear, I'm going to make it last longer. I am so anxious about what's going to happen that through my anxiety, I'm just going to delay it for longer. In fact, that is the exact point that Jesus made. By being anxious, you cannot make your life even an hour longer. You do not have the power to retain the spirit, and you do not have the power over the day of death. It's hard. And that's something that we all have to wrestle with. We all have to wrestle with that knowledge that it's going to happen. It is an absolute certainty that you do not have power to retain the spirit, and you cannot worry yourself into not dying. Can't be done. Now, if that is the truth, then we all need to accept and prepare for that eventuality. That's really the only logical, sane, rational thing to do. It's not rational and sane and logical to say, oh, I'm so afraid of that eventuality, I don't want to face it, I'm not going to even think about it. And yet that's what most people do. Most people live their life trying their very, very best not to think about it. It's not a fun thing to do. There's a reason that if you have a wedding, more people are probably going to attend your wedding than if you have a funeral, attend your funeral. There's a lot of people who have never been to one. Because we don't like to face it, we don't like to think about it, we don't like to deal with it. We live in a slavery of fear, and yet, as we look through this, you can't stop it, your anxiety can't change it, and by your desires, you can't prolong it from happening. And so, the only logical thing is to prepare for it. So let's talk about us as Christians. How scary is death if we are saved, or if by God's grace and Jesus' blood we are made righteous? Let's look at a few passages that talk about that. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 seems like a really good place to start this discussion. This is the exact discussion that Paul was having with the Corinthians in this section of text. And he mentions it this way in verse 25 and verse 26. He says, "For he," meaning Jesus, "must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet." The last enemy to be destroyed is death. And then skip down towards the end of the chapter, verses 54 and following. He says, "When the perishable puts on imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? For the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. He says for us as Christians, death has been conquered by Christ. It doesn't mean that you're not going to die. In fact, that's the exact point that Paul makes here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. That you are, but Jesus has conquered death. He has removed the sting, he has removed its victory, and has given the victory to himself. There is no more true death for the Christian. Bodies will die, but our spirits, they go back to God. And that victory is there for us. If you go over to Luke chapter 12, and in verse 4, Luke chapter 12, there in verse 4, he gives us the command to not fear. In fact, most of chapter 12 is dealing with this topic of not fearing. But we're going to pick on verse 4. Now, while specifically here in verse 4, he is talking about individuals who can kill the body, I think the application applies across the board. If I'm not going to fear an individual who can kill my body and then have nothing more to do with me, it's a command not to fear death. So verse 4, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and then after that have nothing more that they can do. Don't do it. Don't fear those who can kill the body and then have nothing more. In fact, he goes on in verse 5 to tell us what to fear. But I warn you whom to fear. Fear him who after he is killed has the authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. He goes on in verse 6 that are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is forgotten before God. He says, even the hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not, for you are more valuable than many sparrows. The promise in verse 4 is not that there's nobody to kill the body, there's no death. That isn't the promise in verse 4. The command in verse 4 is not to fear. If death has been conquered, and our souls go back to God, then what fear is there? What fear should there be here in Luke chapter 12, verse 4? Seems to be Jesus' point. And then I want to look at Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews chapter 6. The Hebrew writer writes his letter to Christians who seem to be giving up on their faith. And he encourages them through the entire book not to backslide, not to give up, not to give in. And then he reminds them here that we have a certainty of this promise from God, that our souls have an anchor. And he makes this point in verses 19 and verse 20. He says, we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner places behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. He makes the point back in verse 17, verse 18, that God, when he desires to show more convincingly to us, his heirs, the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed with an oath, so that by 2 unchangeable things, in which it's impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge may have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that is set before us. For we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. And the imagery is a really beautiful imagery that he gives here in chapter 6. So he makes the point there's 2 things that God says is unchangeable. One is God's character, and the second one is the oath in which he swore that we have a place with him. And then he makes the point that Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf into heaven, and he has anchored our souls there. That when we are untethered here, we are moored there. It's a beautiful imagery. So if I have something that is sure and steadfast, what fear is there? Or what fear should be there? I want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Here Paul speaks of a different mentality than the world has, and sometimes a different mentality than we as Christians have, but it's certainly the mentality that we as Christians should have. So I want to read verses 1 through 10. I know some of these readings are a bit more lengthy, but to go through them is highly important given the subject matter. Paul says this, we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, that's eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. If indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent we groan, being burdened. Not that we should be unclothed, but that we should be further clothed. So what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared for us this very thing is God, who has given us his Spirit as a guarantee. We are always of good courage, for we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith and not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Again, he's using more analogies to help us understand this. For those who like camping or like tenting, or for those who don't, imagine at least that you like tenting or camping, and you have a favorite tent, one that you really like, and it's semi-comfortable as tents go. What happens when you lose it? Just go home. That's it. You lose your tent, you just go home. And that's the beauty of tenting. If you lose your tent, if it happens to fly off into the ocean, you just go home. And you don't mourn all that much over your tent. Hopefully not, Lee. Hopefully you don't mourn, because it's just a tent, right? Who thinks, oh no, I can't be happy, I have a house because I've lost my tent? That's the analogy he gives here in chapter 5. And it's a very different mentality than the world has. He says our earthly bodies are our tent. And when we lose this tent, we get to go home. To a home not made with hands, eternal in the heavens, that is there with God. And so he makes, here in verse 6, we are always of good courage, knowing that while we're here in the body, we're away from the Lord. And he goes on to say even further that we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Again, not a mentality that is common to the world. That I long and I groan that I'm burdened here, and I long to be with God. And that's the point that he makes. He says in verse 4, that while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened. Imagine if you had to live in a tent for the next couple years. Would you groan, being burdened? Every day waking up on the hard earth, every day trying to fix all the leaks, to try to hold out some of the weather, the heat and the cold. That's the analogy that he gives. I would really like to have a house with an HVAC system. I would like, dishwasher and stove and all the amenities of a house. He makes an analogy for us. While we're here on this earth, we groan. How many of us in the last 12 months haven't groaned over the life that we've lost? People that we've lost? Of the hardships that we have faced? The illnesses that we've been diagnosed with? Illnesses of our family that they've been diagnosed with? Mourn over our economy or over our government? Mourn over the sins around us in the world? There's a lot of groaning that happens in this tent. And he makes the point that we're of good courage here because we know that whenever we put off our mortality, we put on immortality. And that groaning goes away. And so, more than just the fact that death has been conquered and we have a sure anchor for the soul, he advocates for us to have a mindset of true, indelible hope and a longing to be with God. Not only should we prepare for that eventuality that will happen to all of us, our hope should be such that we look forward to that day in some ways. Death is not to be avoided at all costs. We live in a time and a place where we talk about safety first, and maybe safety first is a pretty harmful mentality sometimes. I'm not telling you to go out and be unsafe and just lick fires and that kind of thing. I'm just saying that, that's a bad analogy. But there are things that are more important and worth dying for. And there are things that are worse than death. If Jesus and the apostles and the early Christians lived their lives on the basis of safety first, the church would have gone nowhere. It would have died in its infancy before anything even got started. Because safety first was not the mentality that they had. They had a hope that lasted beyond safety first here. All of the apostles died, not of their own hands and not of natural causes as far as we can tell. All of them. Because safety first was not their main priority. Pleasing and serving God, serving one another, filling their obligations to one another, and in their worship to God, that was more important than safety first. They didn't go seeking death. That wasn't the goal. The goal wasn't to find danger. The goal wasn't to martyr themselves quickly. That wasn't at all the purpose. The purpose was to live in a life that is pleasing to God and in service to others. And if that happened to lead to death, which for them it did, that was acceptable. And there are many early Christians who had the exact same mentality, where they were going to live a life that was in pleasing to God and in service to others. And if it happened to end in their death, which some did and some did not, that was okay. Because that purpose was more important than through my worry and my anxiety extending life. I want to read Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13. It's one of the more striking passages in the book of Revelation, which is a striking book already. John has been told to write all that he sees, and then he sees an angel, or he hears a voice rather, in verse 13, tells him again to write. So after he's been told to write all of this, there's a pause, and then there's a voice from heaven that says, you really, really need to write this. And I want us to consider what the voice says here in verse 13. And I heard the voice from heaven saying, write this. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and for their deeds follow them. We've been talking about this on Wednesday night, the concept of being blessed. Not simply happy, but finding favor with God. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. He's mentioned some of them previously in the book. The individuals who were martyred and were incense before God. Their prayers came up as incense before Him. And He says, blessed are they who die in the Lord. There's a blessing to that process. It happens to all of us. It's going to happen. And blessed are those who die in the Lord, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Now, this mentality, this idea that we're putting forward, that the Scripture, I believe, advocates for us, has some challenges. It's not just a matter of waking up one day and saying, okay, I have no fear of death. I just long for and expect that. Because there are things that get in our way. Being human, we get in our own ways. So I would suggest a couple of these. One is a lack of rock-solid faith in the unseen. We had talked about Hebrews chapter 11 not too long ago. And one of the main themes that runs through Hebrews chapter 11 is faith in the unseen. In fact, that is the exact point that he makes there at the beginning of chapter 11. He says in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, that what is seen was made out of things which are invisible. But it doesn't start there. It actually starts in verse 1, that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things unseen. And then he spends the entire chapter talking about people who live their life never seeing the things that they had been promised or the things that they hoped for, never experiencing the things that they had longed for. because they had faith in the unseen. Now, I haven't seen heaven, and you haven't seen heaven. Yeah, I can't assume too much about people, but I feel like it's one of those things that I can assume about you. I haven't seen heaven, you haven't seen heaven. I've never talked to anybody who's eyewitnessed heaven. Haven't. There is no video that we have of anybody going and videotaping heaven. Doesn't exist. For all of us, we have to live our lives never seeing heaven and yet hoping to see it someday. That's the faith we're talking about here in Hebrews chapter 11. A faith that is rock solid, that no matter what happens in life, I believe that it exists, and I believe that God is going to reward those who diligently seek Him. Moses had that faith, Abraham had that faith, Sarah had that faith, Enoch had that faith. That's the faith I'm advocated to have, is to believe in the unseen. And sometimes we lack that. Sometimes we wake up cold sweats in the middle of the night, and what if it doesn't? What if I'm wrong? What if I missed it? What if there's nothing afterwards? And that challenges us to love what we do see. It challenges us to have our hope here and to long for all the things here. And we're called to have a faith that goes beyond what we can see. And that's the point that Paul made in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where we live by faith and not by sight. That our lives have to be ones that are quantified not by the things that we see and touch and feel, but they're quantified by what we don't see and we haven't touched, we haven't felt yet. One of the other challenges is just simply a love of this world and things of this world. As much as we groan, as much as we burden, as much as we deal with all the problems of life, there's still a lot to really love about life. There's a lot of really cool things, a lot of cool places, there's a lot of nice people, there's a lot of good experiences. There's something really great about putting on a fresh pair of socks or tasting some really good Indian food. All analogies, I'm sure, have no consequence on your life. Whatever it is that you find to be just absolutely enjoyable, there's a lot of that in life. And loving here sometimes detracts from our hope there. The more that I want this, the more that I long for and treasure and look forward to the here and the now, what I can touch and feel and taste, what I can have pride in, really detracts from all the things that I long for in the future. There's a reason that John writes in 1 John chapter 2 not to love the world or the things of the world. For all that is in the world is not from the Father. It doesn't produce the righteousness that God requires. And we are challenged every day, and we are told to love this world. And the more that we love this world, the less we're going to have hope in heaven. And so oftentimes we have become people who love this world, and heaven is something that I kind of want to go if I happen to die, and I don't long for, I don't look forward to that occasion. We also have challenges that, a lack of hope in the sense that our treasure isn't there. We work so long and so often for the treasures here. I don't know how it happened. I moved to Florida and all my stuff fit into one vehicle. We moved out of Florida 5 years later, and we had to sell a whole bunch of stuff. When Brittany was asleep, I threw away a lot of stuff so she wouldn't know it. We still had a moving truck that was jammed full of stuff, and we still left stuff back in Florida. I don't know how the stuff accumulates. We spend so much of our lives accumulating stuff and looking for more stuff to get, and the next thing to buy, the next thing to enjoy. Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount that he's going to go over, not to step on all of his material, not to lay up treasures here on earth, but to lay up treasures in heaven. That really be our treasure, to long for and look for that. We get asked the question and hopefully gave some answers for how scary is death for us who are saved. But I want to ask the question from a different perspective. What if we're unprepared? How scary is death at that point? I think after the last 4 years, I think you guys know that I have an older sister who is unfaithful. And she is terrified over everything that's happened in the last 12 months. She's canceled all of the trips to go see my parents. Whenever we were down near her, we were asked not to come. And my mom had asked if she could go and visit her a couple weeks ago, and my sister said no. We had huge family plans for my dad's birthday, his big 60th birthday, and she canceled all of that as well. She has stopped almost everything in life over fear of what's happened the last 12 months. And I told her that there's a reason you fear. That's a good reason. Because if you're unprepared, then it's a scary thing. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 through verse 31, he makes the point that if we go on sinning deliberately after coming to the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a fearful expectation of the judgment. He goes on to make the point that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. For a God who says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." We've been talking about personal evangelism on our Sunday afternoon Bible study. And it's this very reason that we're trying to reach people. And as we talked about today, hopefully people who are closest to us, people who we have the most ability to influence and to touch. Because we understand their predicament. We are all marching towards the cliff at some point in time. We're all going to go over. If we are prepared, then there's a joy that comes along with it. That death is conquered. That whenever we are unmoored here, we are held fast there. That we long for that day because we get to be away from our tent and at home with God. But if you haven't been saved, it's a terrifying with a sure prospect. As sure as our prospect is for hope and glory and a home with God, their prospect is equally sure. That's a fearful thing to fall in the hands of a living God. And you know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." That phrase there in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 30. He writes to an audience who is well familiar with the Old Testament, who has seen, God's vengeance splashed on the pages through the prophets and through the books of history. He says, you know him. You know him. You know that this isn't something that has changed in his character. So if I know that I'm going to die, and I do, then I need to be prepared. There's no excuses, no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no, at a future time, then I'll get right. It doesn't work that way. As long as I have opportunity today, then I need to take the opportunity today. And so the invitation is open, as it always is, as long as there still is breath, to make things right, knowing that that eventuality is going to be there. It's going to happen for me, it's going to happen for you, and maybe today, or it may be 40 years from now, I don't know. But prepare now. Have hope now. I want to end the exact place where we started, Hebrews chapter 2. We had used a phrase there in chapter 2 to make a point, but I didn't use the verse correctly. To show you why. Verse 15. Verses 14 and verse 15. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all of those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. We have the opportunity through Jesus to no longer live a life in slavery of fear of death. That's it. That's where we have come to as Christians. That's the hope that is given to us. That we can face that end with hope, with longing, with joy, while we mourn and we long for those who have gone on before us. When it's our time, we don't have to live in slavery. And if we can help you in any way to make that true for you, to make your calling and election sure, let us know as we stand in singing number 830, or 829. 829.